Hey everybody, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. We're continuing our learning of the skull and of the landmarks of the skull. So, I have a projected image here. Before I show you this projected image and what it's supposed to be for, and before we label it, I want to do something with you so that it makes learning all the foramina of the skull much easier. So here's what we're going to do. If you're looking at the skull, the roof of the skull that we can pop off is called the calvaria. Now obviously in a real human, these are attached and you'd have to use a bone saw to cut around and remove it. But this is called the calvaria, like the word Calvary, when you send the cavalry in. So the calvaria is the lead point, okay? Now, we're gonna take the calvaria off the skull and set it aside. We don't need it. If we're looking at the front of the skull, if I actually have him turn around and look away from me, and then look up at the ceiling, I'm going to see all these bumps and holes and grooves and ridges inside the skull. And I'm going to show you a close-up of this in the next video. But I like to label everything so that you can see it, and then we repeat it here with the real skull, or the real model of the skull, and we'll learn it. But that's what you're looking at, is you're seeing all these bones, all these bumps and ridges and openings in the skull. Now, when I was a student, a lot of students had a very difficult time learning all of these. And my lab partner and I laughed our way through all of this. She was much older than I was, an African-American lady. And we realized that two of the primary drives of all living organisms is the desire to survive as an individual. That means find food and avoid becoming food. And to survive as a species, which means to reproduce as often as possible. That's what deer do, that's what cats and dogs and all animals do. And really we're driven to do the same two things. So if we could relate anything to food or reproduction, we wouldn't forget it. And we came up with a bunch of funny sayings to memorize these in order. Now, if you follow the list of things to know, it's going to have you jumping from one side of the skull to the other and learning this hole and then this hole and then look over here. You get lost. So we figured it's always easy to just start with the most obvious one that we know, and if we memorize them in order, we should be able to always be able to identify them. That way on a test, if someone asks me to identify that, I can go magnum, hypoglossal, correct. Oh, that's the foramen lacerum, and never miss it. So there's a method to my madness if you follow along. I do realize that it's projecting on me, and I realize that, well, I'm at a funny angle because there's a hot spot for my projector that would be in the middle of the picture, so it's kind of off to the side now. So what I'm going to do is this. This picture is on my Canvas page. If you go into the modules for the skeletal system, you'll see this picture. You can download it. It's under the skull images. You can download it. It's called the foramina. Foramen means hole. Foramina is plural for foramen. You can download this picture and print it. And what we did was we put a numbering system, and we learned the first 6. We learned the next 5 because there's 11 holes here. 11 going this way or 11 going this way. There's a few others, but we're not going to learn those. And then we're going to learn all these bumps and holes and grooves and ridges. I'm going to run through how I learned it. And I'm actually going to write these out for you first. So I'm going to turn the projector off. Forgive me a second. And I'm going to do this in 2 sets of turns. And I'm going to kind of write them going on one side up one way, another group here, and then I'm going to write a third group coming down, because we're going to learn the skull going up and then coming back down. We do the holes going up and the bumps coming down. And you'll see what I mean when we actually do the skull. So when you look at these terms on my list on my picture, they are listed this way. There are 6 openings that are listed on the left side of the image. They could very easily be listed on the right side. Now, anytime I use the letter F, it's going to stand for the term foramen. I don't want to write the word foramen out every time, but on a lab test you would have to type it in. There's a rule in the Latin language that says you can't have, you can't have a soft consonant and a hard consonant, like an L on one word, end, and then have a hard consonant like an M next to that, right? So you can't have, essentially, because of the rules of the Latin language, sometimes the word foramen is going to come before the descriptive term. Sometimes it's going to come second. You have to learn it the way that it's written on the list, okay? So now, let me write these a little bit bigger. But the first one on our picture is called the foramen. I'm just going to write it out. It's called the foramen magnum. Magnum means very large or really big. The second one on the list, number 2 on the picture, is going to be called the hypoglossal foramen. I can have 2 hard consonants or 2 soft consonants, and that's why they switch it around. It's a rule in the Latin language. Now, the third one on the list is called the jugular foramen. And some books will call it the jugular canal. The fourth one is called the internal acoustic canal. And let me just tell you this, the term acoustic and the term auditory are interchangeable. They both refer to hearing. So some people will call it the internal acoustic canal, some will call it the internal auditory canal, and you'll also see this term, meatus, and it's pronounced meatus, okay? Now let me explain something and why this is important. If I have a thin piece of bone with a hole in it, I'm either outside the skull or inside the skull, then this would be called a foramen. If I have a really thick piece of bone that has a hole at either end, the hole on either end is called a meatus. That's the opening at either end, and the space in the middle would be called the canal. So there's going to be an external auditory meatus and an external auditory canal. There's going to be an internal auditory meatus and an internal auditory canal. Or we could say internal acoustic. So, you can put internal acoustic meatus or internal auditory meatus, or you could put internal acoustic canal or internal auditory canal. I don't care how you learn it. Different books have it listed differently. Okay? However it's written on our list of things to know, you should learn it that way. The one that's labeled number 5 on the picture is going to be called the carotid canal. Okay? And it's called a canal because it's an elongated groove. And this is the term carotid. Like you would say rotted meat, carotid, not keratoid. There's no extra I in there. So it's the carotid canal, or no extra O. Carotid canal. That's where your carotid arteries go into your brain. And then the one that's number 6 on there is called the foramen lacerum, or some people say lacerum. So the first 6 holes, foramen magnum, hypoglossal foramen or canal, jugular foramen, internal acoustic canal or internal auditory canal or internal acoustic meatus or internal auditory meatus, the carotid canal, and the foramen lacerum. Learn them the way that they're written on the list. Now, my lab partner and I took the first letter of the major part of each word, and we were trying to come up with a funny sentence, and she came up with, my husband Joe is a creative lover, which conjured images I didn't want to think about, but nonetheless, magnum, hypoglossal, jugular, internal acoustic, carotid, lacerum. You can come up with your own sentence, your own names, whatever you want to do, but that's how we learn them. First we learn this, and then we put the complete word together. I'm going to show them to you on the picture in a second, and we'll use this to memorize them. I'm going to erase a little bit of this, and I'm going to do the next 5. So, if you look on the picture, I could have labeled the 6 on either side, and then the other 5 on the other side. I mean on the same side, but I ran out of room. So, if we pick up where number 6 lifts off, number 7 is called the foramen spinosum. Now let me check my camera. I want to make sure that you can read everything that I'm writing on the board. Yeah, you can. So, let me write it straight across here and write it a little bit bigger. Number 7 on the picture is going to be called the foramen spinosum. I'll explain the name in a moment. Number 8 is called the foramen. Oops, I didn't spell it right. Excuse me a second. Number 8 on the picture is called the foramen ovale. And a lot of people want to say ovale, but the E is pronounced. It's a Greek and Latin term. So foramen ovale. Okay. Number 9 is the foramen rotundum. This is an oval hole. That's a round one. Rotund is round. The next one on the picture is going to be the superior orbital fissure. That's the longest one. And then the last of the holes that we're going to learn is going to be called the optic canal. So if you put these in order, spinosum ovale rotundum, superior orbital fissure, and optic. Now on the lab test, you're going to have to include the foramen or the canal in the name, but for now, if I take the first letter, it's S-O-R-S and then an O, sorso. And y'all don't need to know this. I'll show you in a minute why we came up with this, but we figured if something has wings, it soars up and then over. We just misspelled the soars, we left the A out, but it soars up and over. S-O-R-S-O. So, magnum, hypoglossal, jugular, internal acoustic, carotid, lacerum, spinosum, ovale, rotundum, superior orbital fissure, and optic. Now, you're going to have to learn the complete names, but if you can do all 11 and you know where to start, you should be able to name them very, very easily. Now, I'm going to erase all this, and I'm going to give you the writing for the last few structures, okay? Or actually, I'll probably do that on the picture. So let me project the image again. Let me turn my projector on. Let it fire up. But this is sort of a much easier way of memorizing all the foramina of the skull. And while the picture is booting up, let me just show you this. If I look underneath the skull, if I stare into his eyes, have him look away and look up at the ceiling, there's a really large hole in the skull. I can't miss it. You can stick your finger through it. The largest hole that you can see is the foramen magnum. Now this is a picture that we took, and then I drew the little lines on here, and I put these numbers on with PowerPoint or whatever, but it helps us find all of these. And some of these I actually had to create because the angles that we're looking at, you couldn't really see them. But this one is number 1. This is the foramen magnum. Then if I'm running my finger inside the skull through the foramen magnum from the bottom, if I withdraw my finger, there's a little flat wall right here, kind of right at the front edge. And in that flat wall, there's a hole that goes through there that goes underneath your tongue. Since a glossa is tongue, that's the hypoglossal foramen on either side. Now, if I continue to work my way up that same wall, the next opening is going to be rather large and jagged. The jagged one is the jugular. Magnum, hypoglossal, jugular. Foramen magnum, hypoglossal foramen, jugular foramen. Now, you don't get to do this unless you buy a plastic skull, but if I ran my finger up from underneath, there's a big flat wall that goes up, and then my finger will bend over and it will go back down the other side. There are 4 holes leading up to this ridge right here. Magnum, hypoglossal, jugular. That one's called the internal acoustic. And I'm going to show it to you on the model where you can see it much more closely. But foramen magnum, hypoglossal foramen, jugular foramen, internal acoustic canal, or internal auditory meatus, or however it's written on the list. There's a large ridge here. If I go over the ridge, there's 2 holes that are connected by a slight groove. I don't think you can see it here on the way the image is projected, but this is called the carotid canal, and then the groove takes me up to the middle to the foramen lacerum. Carotid lacerum, near this middle piece. So magnum, hypoglossal, jugular, internal acoustic, carotid lacerum. My husband Joe is a creative lover. Magnum, hypoglossal, jugular, internal acoustic, carotid lacerum. My wife's name is Stephane, not Joe, but I didn't know her back then, and I used my lab partner's saying. So my magnum, hypoglossal, jugular, internal acoustic, carotid lacerum. Foramen magnum, hypoglossal foramen, jugular foramen, internal acoustic canal or meatus, carotid canal, foramen lacerum. Okay. Now, if I'm at these two openings on the skull, when we look inside of it, if I go just laterally, there's going to be a little tiny opening here. Looks like someone took a little tiny porcupine spine and poked a hole. That's the foramen spinosum. That's number 7 on the picture. Right above that is an oval one called the foramen ovale. And when we do look down inside the skull, they're pretty easy to see. Now, this piece of bone is part of our sphenoid bone. We have the frontal bone up here, we have the the temporal bones over here, and we have the occipital bone back here, and they all meet up at these sutures. This is the sphenoid all the way across. We can see it on either side on the outside, we can see it through the orbit, and this is the sphenoid running across. The sphenoid has 2 wings. If you follow this little line, it runs all the way across. It looks like a funky looking kite or bat or plane that could glide. This is called the lesser wing of the sphenoid. These 2 pieces right here are much larger wings. They're called the greater wings of the sphenoid. Now, when I was a student, we had to know the lesser wing and the greater wing. They're not on your list unless you're in someone else's class. Now, but the reason I tell you that is we figured, well, if this bone has wings, it soars. And this is the soars up and then over this little point. And when we look inside the skull, you're going to see that this bone actually folds up and comes up underneath this little ridge sticking here. And then this opening is underneath the edge of the ridge. And then over the ridge, or the point, is the optic. So, spinosum ovale rotundum, the foramen rotundum. Foramen spinosum, foramen ovale, foramen rotundum. This is an elongated crack that comes out in the orbit called the superior orbital fissure. And then over this point is the optic. If I did it on this side, it would be foramen spinosum, foramen ovale, foramen rotundum, superior orbital fissure, optic. That's the soars up and over. S-O-R-S-O. Spinosum ovale, rotundum, superior orbital fissure, and optic. Okay? Now, when it comes to the remainder of the landmarks, if you look on the picture, I don't know if you can see it, but this one up here is number 12. Now, I want to show you something, and then we're going to get to the real skull models in a moment. Our frontal bones come together and have a gap between them. And sitting underneath the frontal bone here would be the ethmoid bone right in the middle. The ethmoid bone has a little ridge that sticks up and a little plate on either side that fits here. So this is actually part of the ethmoid bone sticking up between the 2 parietal bones. There's a little fin that sticks up. And that little piece that sticks straight up, this little red piece right here, or I'll use blue since I already used that number. This little piece that sticks up right here is called the crista galli. Now, galli comes from the word gallo, which means rooster, and crista means comb, like the rooster's comb on top of their head. So they called it the crista galli. On either side of the crista galli, there's a plate of bone that comes down here. And that plate of bone has many, many holes in it. I don't know if you've ever seen this kitchen tool that looks like an ice cream scoop, but has a little metal net that has lots of holes. It's called a sieve, a kitchen sieve. Like, you know, when you're making coffee, a barista would use them. Well, the term sieve in Latin is cribra. And since this is in the shape of a sieve, it has many little tiny holes in it. This plate, this entire plate here, number 13, is called the cribriform plate. Crista galli, cribriform plate. Now on our plastic models, it's not going to have holes there. It'll just be a little groove because they didn't drill them out. Now, in the middle of the sphenoid bone, again, it's very difficult to see because we're looking at a flat picture, but the sphenoid bone has a little piece that if I drag my finger straight down, it's going to fall off this bone, which comes down and scoops back up. It's almost like a big U-shaped structure. And if I could cut all of this out, let me use a different color. If I could cut this piece right here, all of this, all the way over here, all the way up to this piece, and I cut it out of the skull and turn it sideways, it would look like this. Okay? This little point would be this point right here. this piece right here sticks up like a little horn or a little piece that sticks up there. If I look at it, I could set a person in here and their bottom end would sit there and their legs would stick out like they're sitting in a saddle, or if you were sitting in a kid's swing, or actually, if you have children, there's a thing called a bumpo seat. I don't know if it's bumbo or bumpo seat, but it's a little seat that looks like this. You set your kid in it, and you can walk away for days, and I mean, just kidding. But it helps your kids from running around the house, okay, while you're trying to heat up their food or something to feed them. Well, this thing, like this, is twisted, and we're looking down on top of it, and this part would be the back side here. This would be the front side sticking up. And because it looks like the saddles that the Turkish would ride with, they called it the sella. If you speak Spanish, sella means saddle, turcica, which means Turkish saddle. So that's going to be this structure, this whole thing all the way around. And on the list, it's actually number 15. It asks you for the U-shaped part. And the U-shaped part is called the sella turcica. And it's written over here. Now, if I look at the sella turcica, the actual seat or bottom of the saddle is called the hypophyseal fossa. It looks like the word hypophyseal, hypophyseal, fossa. A fossa is a shallow depression, and the hypophysis is the pituitary. And in all reality, your pituitary gland hangs right here inside your brain. And so it protects the pituitary. So the sella turcica is the part that sticks up, the big U-shaped area. But this little middle piece that I'm going to highlight in blue here is going to be number 14 on the list. And that's going to be the hypophyseal fossa. And that really confuses a lot of students. So make sure you work on that. Okay? So look, cristagalli, cribriform plate, the sella turcica, and the middle part is the hypophyseal fossa, the bottom of it, okay? And then I finally have this large ridge here. It's hard for you to see, but I'm going to show you when we look at the model. But the temporal bone has a big rock-like ridge like this, and a flat piece that sticks up on the side. The rock-like portion, number 16 on my numbering system here, is going to be called the petrous part. Now, Petra, Peter, piedra, means rock. So the petrous part is the thick rock-like portion behind your ear. It's a very thick part of the temporal bone. And as the temporal bone sticks up, so I have this large ridge, the flat wall here where the squamous suture is called the squamous part. So number 17 on the picture is going to be the squamous part. Let me erase this. But number 17, where it asks for the flat side wall, is the squamous part or squamous portion of the temporal bone. So we've only learned 17 things. The first 11 are holes: magnum, hypoglossal, jugular, internal acoustic, carotid, lacerum. Magnum, hypoglossal, jugular, internal acoustic, carotid, lacerum. Spinosum ovale rotundum, superior orbital fissure, and optic. Spinosum ovale rotundum, superior orbital fissure, and optic. They're right here by the sphenoid bone, by that sella turcica. Now, the little bone that sticks up in here is the cristagalli, the cribriform plate, the sella turcica, the middle of the sphenoid bone, and the bottom of that is the hypophyseal fossa. The big ridge sticking up here is the petrous part, and the flat side wall of the skull is going to be called the squamous part. So, I want you to learn those 17 structures, and then we're going to learn a few more, and we'll be done with the entire skull. Then we only have the rest of the skeleton to do. Alrighty? So thanks for watching. I'm going to show you these structures on the skull in the next video. I'll see you on the flip side. Hope you had as much fun as I did.